All right, so this is the last day one lecture, and this is my lecture that I'm calling the Ethics FAQ lecture. So in this lecture, we're going to just address some questions that students often have about ethics, and this will put us in a better position to engage in the issues that we'll be discussing in the rest of the course. So part one is going to be a discussion of the distinction between ethics and meta-ethics. And then in part two, I'll do a kind of pep talk. And also, I'm really hoping that the sound quality is better in this lecture. I've been having some trouble with that, so my apologies. Hopefully it'll be better this time. Okay, so let's notice the following distinction. There are two kinds of questions we can ask about ethics. So first, we can ask questions about particular ethical issues. This is what we'll be calling ethics. Second, we might also have sort of broader, bigger picture questions about what ethics even is. This is what we call meta-ethics. So let me give you a couple little scenarios to make this distinction more clear. Suppose we have this little guy. His name is Sticky, and he will be with us in a variety of lectures throughout this term. Sticky wakes up one morning and goes to get the newspaper. He brings it back to his office. He sits down and he reads it, and he sees in the newspaper an announcement that says that there's a protest Sunday at 11 a.m., and he reads "Stand Up for Justice." And he thinks to himself, knowing what the protest is about, he thinks, I agree with that. That is an issue I care about. I should go protest. But then he has a second thought, which is that he remembers that he lives with his elderly grandparents. And it's the middle of the pandemic, and he knows that if he participates in the protest, he may bring the virus back home and infect his grandparents who are vulnerable. So he starts to worry. He thinks to himself, gosh, what should I do? On the one hand, I care about justice and I agree with the cause of the protest. I think I have a duty to stand up for justice. On the other hand, I'm worried about my grandparents and I think I should protect them. So he has an ethical dilemma now. He doesn't know whether he should protest or protect his family. So that's scenario one. Now consider a different kind of scenario where Sticky again wakes up. He gets the newspaper. This time he decides to take the newspaper with him to the park. He walks by a couple reading. On his walk, he also encounters another set of people, and these people are having a discussion. He overhears the following. The first person says, I think we should be protesting. The second person says, but I wouldn't be able to live with myself if I brought the virus home. Now, thinking about this conversation, which he overheard, Sticky starts to ask himself all different kinds of questions now. In fact, he starts to ask himself questions about morality. He's thinking about these people having a moral disagreement, and he starts to wonder, are the two things that they say just their opinions, or are they in some sense disagreeing about a real matter of fact? And so he asks himself, are my moral beliefs just opinions? Pardon the typo there, moral beliefs. This leads into the thought, are there any moral truths at all? And even if there were moral truths, how could I know them? So in these two different scenarios, Sticky is engaged in two different types of activities. In the second scenario we looked at, where he's thinking about the disagreement between the two friends, say, that he witnessed, Sticky is asking himself, are my beliefs just opinions? Are there any moral truths at all? Even if there are, how could I know them? Here, Sticky is doing meta-ethics. That is, he is asking questions about ethics, about what ethics is. This is not the focus of this course, except for the next 10 minutes or so. But when Sticky is thinking about whether or not he should protest or stay home to protect his family, here Sticky is doing ethics. And this is what we'll be focusing on in the course. He is asking about a particular moral question. about right or wrong and about what his obligations are. He's not asking himself about the nature of ethics itself. So again, to reiterate, these are two very important types of questions. Ethical questions and meta-ethical questions are both important. This course is primarily about ethics, not meta-ethics. Okay, but you might at this point have a worry. You might think to yourself, that's well and good that we have this distinction, but how could we even do ethics before we do meta-ethics? So you might think of a particular ethical question. Here's one that we're going to talk about. Is it wrong to participate in online public shaming? And you might think to yourself that before you can really answer this question, you need to ask some meta-ethical questions. You might think, I should ask, how can we know whether online shaming is something that's wrong? Is there even an objective fact of the matter as to whether participating in online shaming in any given instance is wrong? Or is this, in some sense, something that's subjective? And you might think you should ask, well, if someone judges that online shaming is wrong, is that moral judgment more like a belief, which could be true or false? Or is it more like a preference, just something you like or dislike? And indeed, you might think that in some sense, you should be able to answer these kind of questions before you are able to answer the question, is it wrong to participate in online public shaming? So this is the kind of worry you might have about doing ethics before you do any meta-ethics. Now, I'm not going to decide this issue right now, other than to say if you're interested in it, there are other courses in the philosophy department that you can take which will address this issue. Instead, I want to say a little bit more about the different views that there are in metaethics so that you have a sense of the territory, and then to sort of at least point to some ways in which, if you are worried about whether we can do ethics before metaethics, maybe there are a few things I can tell you that will make you a little bit less worried about that. All right, so this page here in the slide that follows is inspired by a work by Dustin Locke, which simplifies a very complicated paper by Michael Smith that's been very influential in metaethics. So in this paper, Smith asks this basic question, whether moral judgments are more like beliefs or more like preferences, and he distinguishes between a variety of different views one might have on this, which divide into two main categories. So on the one hand, we have the view that they are more like beliefs, and we're going to call this cognitivism. And if moral judgments are more like beliefs, then when I judge, say that, let's say I judge that participating in online shaming is not morally wrong. Suppose I say that. If cognitivism is true, then my judgment can be either true or false. It might be true, it might be false. And I'm also trying to say something about how the world is when I make that judgment. On the other hand, if the alternative view, which we're calling non-cognitivism, is true, then when I make the moral judgment that online shaming is not wrong, or that it can be okay to do, then I'm really just expressing my preference. My judgment really can't be true or false. I'm not really trying to represent the way the world is. I'm just expressing kind of my own preference. And so in this sense, my moral judgment is more like a desire than a belief. But that's not the only distinction one can make. There are further distinctions within these categories. So suppose we go back to the view that moral judgments can be true or false, and so in this sense are more like beliefs, cognitivism. Well, I could be a reductivist about moral judgments, and that would mean that I think moral facts, so what makes moral judgments true and false? Moral facts. But on this view, moral facts are explained by non-moral facts. What kind of things might those be? Well, maybe it turns out it's facts about what's pleasurable to people. Maybe the moral facts are determined by what produces the most pleasure. Maybe they're determined by facts about people's preferences. Maybe they're determined about facts about what God commands. That is, maybe God determines the moral facts. Maybe they're facts about what a society just agrees on. That would be a very different view. So these are all different incompatible views down here, but notice that you could be a reductivist, a person who thinks moral facts are explained by non-moral facts, and you might be either a naturalist or a non-naturalist about these facts. So broadly speaking, if you're a non-naturalist, you think that the moral facts are explained by things that, roughly speaking, science could never discover and are not really in the same kind of inquiry as science is engaged in. So if you think that moral facts are explained by facts about God's commands, you might be a non-naturalist reductivist. If you think they're explained by facts about pleasure, that would be more of a naturalist position. Remembering all these details is not important. I just want you to have a sense of the possible views. Okay, but you could also be a cognitivist who is a non-reductivist. What does that mean? That means you think moral judgments can be true or false, and they're made true or false by moral facts, but moral facts aren't reducible to anything else. They're sort of, they're just rock bottom. They ground out there. You might say, if you're a proponent of this kind of view, that moral facts are fundamental aspects of the world, just like mass and charge are, say, in physics. So they themselves would have no further explanation if this view is correct. Another way of being a cognitivist, which is sort of a radical kind of view, would be to endorse an error theory. So what does this mean? If you believe in this view, then you think that moral judgments are like beliefs and that they can be true and false, but in fact, they're all false. Here's one way you might explain that. You might believe that moral judgments are all false because they all assert the existence of properties that don't in fact exist. So maybe when I say that online shaming is wrong, if that was my view, then I would be saying that online shaming has the property of being wrong, which is a kind of thing that I'm claiming exists in the world. And it would turn out that my judgment is false because there are no such things as properties of wrongness. That would be another kind of meta-ethical view one might have. This is not even all the kinds of views one might have if one were a cognitivist about moral judgments, but it does give you a sense of the territory. Let's look at the other side. So the other side says that moral judgments are not like beliefs, they're more like preferences, and they cannot be true or false. So when I say online shaming is wrong, I'm not saying something that can be true or false. Now, one version of a view like this is called emotivism, and this says that making a moral judgment is more like having an emotion. So when I say online shaming is wrong, really the right understanding of that statement, if you were sort of to translate it in a way that captures what that statement is really like, it would be like my saying, boo online shaming. So boo online shaming is not a statement that can be true or false. It's an expression of an emotion. In this case, a sort of negative expression of an emotion. But there are other kinds of non-cognitivist views. So one view that Michael Smith discusses is called plan-based non-cognitivism. Again, you don't need to know this, but this view says that making a moral judgment is like having a plan. So maybe if I say that online shaming is wrong, that means I kind of have a plan to respond in certain ways to instances of online shaming that I see in the world. And one might further say on an account like this that disagreeing is just to reject another person's plan. So many people in metaethics are interested in explaining what's going on when people engage in moral disagreement. Are they disagreeing about facts or not? And if you're a non-cognitivist, then you might say that, well, maybe disagreeing in the context of moral debate is just a kind of rejecting another person's plan. You can see that it would be a little bit, the account of moral disagreement for emotivists is a little bit strange. So when I disagree with somebody about online shaming, maybe I'm saying, boo, online shaming, and the other person is saying, yay, online shaming. And it's not the kind of disagreement that we would normally have about matters of fact, because what we're saying is just sort of the expression of an emotion. It's not a view that can be true or false. And there are other views. We can't go through them all, but one might also be a non-cognitivist and think that when I say that online shaming is wrong, I'm just issuing a command. I'm just telling people don't shame people online. So a kind of command view would be a different form of non-cognitivism. Okay, all this complexity is just to try to get a sense of the variety of views in metaethics. But let me say something about this question that we introduced earlier. Do we need to do metaethics before we can do ethics? So Smith thinks that we do. So he says in his 1994 book, we cannot hope to do normative ethics without first knowing what the standards of correct argument in normative ethics are. And it's metaethics. It's in metaethics that we discover these standards. So this really may be right. And certainly some of the metaethical options that were just summarized on the previous slide would have trouble making sense of, say, moral disagreement, right? But notice that not all of the approaches in metaethics would challenge our practice of asking questions in ethics. So in particular, you can see how there are a variety of views one might have in metaethics where there's no sort of puzzle about whether or not there are moral facts and whether or not we can disagree about them. In fact, these two categories here have in common that there are moral facts. They disagree about the nature of those facts. And so that moral judgments can be true or false. So it does seem like at least there are some views in metaethics that don't have any trouble explaining what we're doing when we engage in moral debate. These two have their own understanding of what moral debate is. It just turns out that it might be a little counterintuitive and not what we all thought to begin with. All right, so you also might sympathize with one of the approaches that I've just reviewed quickly, even if you have no idea how you go about defending it. And that's fine. Like I said, that would maybe be a reason to take a course in metaethics. The point of all this, though, is to caution you against confusing some beliefs you might have about metaethics and some beliefs you might have about ethics. So, for example, consider the claim that it's important to respect the moral opinions of others. I think this is probably something that a lot of people believe, that it's important to respect the moral opinions of others. And I think that oftentimes in ethics classes, students will sort of slide from this claim to this claim, that morality is merely a matter of opinion. But notice that this first claim, it's important to respect the moral opinions of others, this is a claim in ethics. It's a claim about a particular issue, whether or not it's morally good or morally right to respect others and to respect their moral opinions. And it's not too controversial of a claim. This second claim is much more controversial. It's a claim in metaethics. Morality is merely a matter of opinion, it says. And you might believe in this first claim without yet believing in the second claim. Consider this. First, it's difficult to be sure that we have the correct moral beliefs. There are no correct moral beliefs. These are actually both claims in metaethics, but you can see that this first claim, I think, is not too controversial. I think most of us would agree that it's hard to know whether we have the correct moral beliefs. But that doesn't necessarily entail that there are no correct moral beliefs. That's a much more controversial metaethical position. So this is just to caution you against sliding between these kinds of claims. You can believe this without believing that, and likewise you can believe this without believing that. That doesn't mean this isn't right, but it would require further argument. Okay, so that was the sort of ethics primer. I hope that was clear, and please do bring questions about this distinction to sections or discussion. Like I said, it may be the case that we need to do some metaethics before we can be fully confident in the answers we give in ethics, but this course is a course in ethics, and so some of those questions we're just going to have to bracket. Those are the questions in metaethics we would have to answer in a course on metaethics. All right, now we're going to do our little pep talk. All right, so one of the things that we will be using in this course to test issues, to engage in debates, are our moral intuitions. And oftentimes we're going to use thought experiments to test our moral intuitions. So many of you may be um, perhaps too familiar with trolley problems. Some of you may not yet be familiar with trolley problems, but this is the kind of thought experiment where there's a trolley racing down the track and it will hit these 5 people unless you pull the lever, and then you're asked, do you think you should pull the lever? And a lot of people in this thought experiment have the intuition that you should pull the lever. And it's sort of typical then to say, well, what about this other case? Suppose the trolley's going down the tracks and it's going to hit the 5 people, but if you push this man off the track, he'll stop the trolley and save the 5 people, killing the one. And then you're again asked, do you think it would be, should you push the guy off of the bridge to stop the trolley and save the 5? And not everybody, but many people say, no, that's not okay in this case. And of course, then you're asked, well, what's different about these cases such that you should pull the lever in this one, but you should not push the man in that one? And my experience sometimes is that after considering too many thought experiments, sometimes people start to doubt the trustworthiness of their intuitions at all. And what I just want to say as the sort of preliminary note to the course is that I hope you will indeed be critical of your moral intuitions, but I hope that you will not abandon all trust in them. So you should be open to the possibility that your immediate judgments, your immediate moral judgments about cases and scenarios are mistaken, but I don't think you should think that your intuitions have no evidential value at all. So, for example, if I thought intuitively that it's not okay to push the man in this case, but it is okay to pull the lever in this case, when I try to think about, well, what could be different about these two cases? What's morally a relevant difference? If I can't come up with a morally relevant difference, for example, if I think that the fact of physical contact and pushing the guy off the bridge is not a morally relevant difference, then I should be willing to revise my initial response to this case and say, if I think you should pull the lever in this case, then I think you should also push the man in this case. I should be open to revising my judgments in that way, but I don't think that I should think my initial immediate responses to the scenarios have no value at all. I think that those responses give you some clues to what's right. So that's just to trust yourself a little bit when it comes to your moral intuitions. Be a little bit suspicious of them, but don't abandon trust in them completely. All right, and the final little pep talk topic here is I just want to say a little bit about why we look for objections to views. So you will find in this course that we do spend a lot of time trying to come up with objections to the various positions that we're considering. And this is why we do it. One reason is that it helps us to tell when a particular position is implausible. That's clear. So if there's an objection to a view that defeats the view, then we know the view is implausible and we shouldn't accept it. But more importantly, it can also help us build a more convincing case for a view that we think is correct. So what I mean by this is that suppose you have a view that you believe is true, and you want to convince others that it's true. Well, one of the most effective things you can do in a case like that is to explain to the others what would be the most threatening objection that one could make to your position, and then to show that you have an effective response to that objection. If you can respond to the best objection one might make against your position, your argument on the whole will be much more convincing than if you had presented a view without considering any possible counter arguments that might have come from your opponents. So considering an objection that your opponent might make to a position you want to defend, and then explaining how you would reply to that kind of an objection or counter argument is a very convincing way of showing that your own view is correct. And it can also just help you be clear about what the most compelling argument for your position is. So that's why we're going to be looking at objections to views very frequently in this course. to help us advance more compelling arguments. And I think that you'll find that thinking about objections and replies to objections will just help you be better at both criticizing arguments and then at defending your own arguments. So this is kind of bread and butter stuff that we do in philosophy. Um, all right, oops, that is the end of day one. So I will hopefully see you all at the live Zoom meeting. The link is now on Canvas.